Able to teach. When interacting with false teachers, we should initially respond with sincere patience and gentleness. Here's Gene.
I could actually reword that principle and say when interacting with anyone who disagrees with us, we should initially respond with sincere patience and gentleness. This is a powerful principle that comes right from this letter that Paul wrote to Timothy because he was dealing with people who disagreed with him. In fact, he was dealing with people who were definitely false teachers. And back in chapter 2, he gave a serious charge. And let me just review that. He simply said this, Paul did, to Timothy, remind them of these things and charge them before God not to fight about words. This is useless and leads to the ruin of those who listen. Of course, he went on to record some other things, but I believe he comes back to this concept right here in chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. And here's what Paul wrote. The Lord's servant must not quarrel, but must be gentle to everyone, able to teach and patient, instructing his opponents with gentleness. Perhaps God will grant them repentance, leading them to the knowledge of the truth. And you can see very clearly from this verse, he's talking about communication. And he uses a very interesting word in the Greek text. It's didaktikos. It's used in 1 Timothy in the list of qualities of maturity. He talks about didaktikos, being able to teach. And here in 2 Timothy, we have what I like to call a contextual commentary or explanation of what that word actually means. And so with the words that surround this concept of being able to teach, we see how it's related to our character. It's dealing with the way in which we communicate. And so you have these words, the Lord's servant must not quarrel. The Lord's servant must be gentle to everyone, and he's dealing with communication. The Lord's servant must be patient. The Lord's servant must instruct his opponents with gentleness. And that's what makes us able to teach, didaktikos. And that is such a powerful concept in communication. If you break it down and summarize it, you could simply say that we're reflecting the fruit of the Spirit. Because if you go to Galatians and read the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and gentleness, you'll see a tremendous correlation here in terms of the way we communicate with people who disagree with us. There's another interesting insight relative to this, and I came up with this awareness because I had a friend, a fellow teacher, with me at the seminary level. And he taught Koine Greek, which is the language of the New Testament. But he also had his PhD in classical Greek. And by classical Greek, that goes way back to the 5th and the 4th century before Christ. And the word didaktikos was used way before the 1st century. The same basic word, but it had a different meaning. But he had a similar meaning. And he pointed out to me, he said, Gene, if you go back to classical Greek, the word didaktikos meant teachable. But in Koine Greek, it means able to teach. Now, to understand that, we know that language changes. You may have the same word, but a different meaning. For example, if you go back to the King James Version, 1611, it talks about letting your conversation reflect Christ. Well, the word conversation today means what? Our speech. But if you go back to the 1611, in English, it meant your manner of life. It meant everything. It meant not only how you speak, but how you live. And how we speak is a part of how we live. So with that in mind, think about didaktikos. Back in the classical Greek, didaktikos meant teachable. But by the time Paul used it in recording the New Testament, it meant communicating in this gentle, kind way, not being defensive, not counterattacking, but communicating with that kind of spirit, and hopefully people will respond to the truth. But here's the correlation. In classical Greek, it meant teachable. By the time it came into the Koine Greek, the language, the common language in Jesus' day, it meant to be able to communicate with a teachable spirit as well. Communicating sensibly with a teachable spirit. And you see that in the verse here that Paul recorded. You see, the word didn't lose all of its meaning. Way back it meant teachable. By the time it came into the language of the New Testament, it means being able to teach others with a teachable spirit yourself. And that's a beautiful, beautiful concept in relationship to dealing with those who disagree with us. Many of you have heard me share the illustration of a very close friend and a fellow elder with me in church planting. And Mike had a very responsible position in a large organization, and he got up one Saturday morning, and there were a group of people picketing his house. And there was a knock on the door, and there was someone wanting him to sign a document that his institution was actually being unfair to minorities, particularly in terms of processing loans. What would you do? And by the way, standing next to this person was a man with a camera wanting to take a picture, obviously of him resisting. Well, Mike really understood that situation. It's amazing. I heard him tell the story. And he said, well, I'd like to talk to you about this. In fact, he said, why don't you come in? Why don't you invite all of your people out there with the placards to come on in? And they couldn't believe their ears, but Mike was sincere. And so they all marched into his house. They sat in his game room, family room, and Sharon, his wife, served them coffee. And Mike began to share his own story, his concerns growing up in his particular cultural situation. And at one point in time, and by the way, in sharing, he was empathizing with some of their concerns. And even sharing that he shared in some of their concerns. And he had a captive audience as they were listening. And finally, he shared his testimony about Jesus Christ. And he said, I used to have an issue as an unbeliever, and I was concerned about the issue myself, particularly prejudice. But he said, now that I'm a believer in Jesus, I really am concerned about the fact that we should never, ever be prejudiced against anyone. And at that point in time, he began to get amens from those sitting in that room who came to picket his home. Make a long story short, they all walked out the door, thanked him for his hospitality, got on the bus, never heard from them again. I heard him share that story, and I said, wow, what a beautiful illustration of what Paul said in 2 Timothy 2:24 and 25. And I read it to a group of fellow elders, and I read these words in view of that story. The Lord's servant must not quarrel, but must be gentle to everyone, even those who are standing accusing you falsely. Able to teach. How are you going to do that? And patient. Instructing his opponents with gentleness. And perhaps God will grant them repentance, leading them to the knowledge of the truth. And that particular day, these folk did hear the truth. They heard the truth about Jesus Christ, which is the most important truth that anyone can share. So this concept of able to teach applies to so many different situations, not just in extremely hostile situations, but in just the normal routine communications of life. In fact, this is what makes a good father and a good mother in relationship to communicating with our children. However, there's a question. And the question relates to the fact that some people think that Paul was speaking out of two sides of his mouth. But you know what that means, metaphorically. Contradicting himself. Well, here's the question for reflection response. How do we reconcile the difference between Paul's exhortations to Titus to confront false teachers in Crete with this exhortation to take a more sensitive approach as he was writing to Timothy. And here's what he said to Titus. Listen, this doesn't sound like what we just read in Timothy, in that second letter. For there are many rebellious people full of empty talk and deception, especially those from the circumcision party. It is necessary to silence them. Paul is being much more direct. They are ruining entire households by teaching what they shouldn't in order to get money dishonestly. That was their whole motive. And they were destroying Christians. And at that point in time, it called for a much more direct confrontation with these evil people because they weren't going to listen to gentleness. They needed confrontation. So Paul is dealing with a much more intense, destructive situation. In fact, he says this at the end of the letter to Titus, in verses 10 and 11, chapter 3, reject a divisive person after a first and second warning. See, there's the key. At first, you're gentle, as Paul was explaining it to Timothy. But when they keep on and destroy whole households, he says, reject a divisive person after a first and second warning, for you know that such a person has gone astray and is sinning. He is self-condemned. There comes a time, Paul said, when you have to deal with situations directly because people are not responding to a gentle, kind, gracious approach. And that's true even to this day. But it's amazing how disarming it is when you communicate with words that are sensitive. And I think all of us can learn a lesson from what Paul wrote to Timothy. Here's the principle. When interacting with false teachers or with anyone who disagrees with us, we should initially respond with sincere patience and gentleness.